Seahawks fans, wherever you may be. Welcome back for another edition of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. Join your host, Bill Alvstad, and co-host, sports writer and football analyst Keith Myers, as we talk Seahawks football.
Hey Seahawks fans, welcome back to another edition of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Bill Alvstad, sitting down with co-host Keith Myers, here to talk free agency for the Seahawks. We're 1 week into free agency, or at least 1 week as we started the legal tampering period. Seahawks made quite a few moves, both with their own free agents and outside of the existing roster. Brought some great players in, spent some money. It's just been kind of a fun week, really. I thought they've done a great job. We're going to go through the entire roster, position group by position group, to talk about what they've done, and all of it. So it's going to be a great show. Welcome in, man.
Yeah. So the Seahawks aren't done. I think that we need to throw that out there, and like there's a lot of moves that are yet to
any
happen
significant
here.
moves.
Well, the most significant move, I think, will be a player leaving the roster in Jamal Adams, but that may not happen for a while. But they're going to need that cap room at some point. And so just looking at that, that's going to be a situation where he's going to go. And then that will open up a ton of cap space that they can then use for other things.
Have to say that you've been really on that train for a long time. And there are others out there that are not so sure that that's the move, that's going to happen, that he could still have an impact on the roster this year if healthy, obviously with a huge asterisk. And
he's still,
but it is a big number.
Potentially elite player, but he's at an $18 million cap hit for
what is
nothing.
Preventing them from making this move right now? Why haven't they not addressed that to this moment?
Oh, so the reason why they haven't yet is because they, if they cut him now, then it counts towards all of his cap mess counts towards this year's contract or cap, and so it actually hurts them in the cap, not helping them.
But they can designate him as a June 1st no matter what time they cut him, correct?
Yes, but him not being healthy, I think actually is hurting that, because I think they have to he either has to pass a physical in order to get that June 1st designation, or they have to wait.
So if he doesn't pass a physical, this is a good question. I got asked this question on Twitter, specifically about Jamal. And I wasn't sure about the physical question because, a lot of teams, he must have some sort of arbitrary date that needs to happen. Or he gets an injury designation, he's cut, and I'm not sure exactly how that impacts the roster. I know he's got guarantees, and some of those are injuries. I just don't know if it's an overall savings for the Seahawks if they do cut him with an injury designation, or he has to pass the physical before they can cut him. What are the restrictions there, Keith?
It depends on it depends on the wording of his particular contract. This isn't a consistent thing across the league. Oftentimes, things are guaranteed for injury. Sometimes they're partially guaranteed for injury. And so we don't know. And that's kind of the answer. So we just don't know where that sits. If he has this whole thing guaranteed for injury, that means they're paying him no matter what. He's going to count against the cap no matter what. They're just going to bring him back.
And I believe, Keith, that moment has happened, I think, or maybe it hasn't yet. Maybe it's the league start date, calendar year start date, which is March 15th. Maybe that's the date that he needs to, either be off the roster or it kicks in. I can't remember, or it's the 5th day after the Super Bowl. A lot of contracts are worded that way as well. So,
yeah, I don't know. And it might just be that they are, if he can pass a physical, then they get more cap space back. And so
Oh,
therefore for them, they might as well wait.
so let
So
me ask you this: why is somebody like Shelby Harris, which he probably didn't have a physical before he was released, why was he released and not have to go through this?
because he wasn't hurt.
Okay, so he left he left the season on IR, so therefore, he Jamal Adams has certain rights associated with being injured and
Yeah.
having a contract that's guaranteed, where he has to go through the team has to go through certain hoops in order for that
Yeah.
to happen.
So when a player is released with with an injury designation, um, there it has less to do with the cap typically than anything else. What it has to do with is getting the player access to team and league facilities for rehab, making sure that if it's a younger player who hasn't vested yet, that they get at least another year of health insurance to help cover those costs. There's a lot of things that come with an injury designation that have nothing to do with the team or salary cap, and that's why teams are um, open to putting those out there, and not really um, there's no like hesitation to use an injury designation if the player has a hangnail, and it's a young like player like someone who is a undrafted free agent who made the roster and then got hurt or whatever, or even didn't but is getting cut. They tend to do that, is release them with an injury designation so that way they can have access to things like the team facility for rehab. And with vet players, guys like Jamal Adams, you know, a lot of they've vested, so they're going to get additional help and that kind of stuff. Plus, Adams has made enough money he could pay for it himself if he wanted to. But again, they still offer those things. And if it's a guy that you perhaps want around your team, you're going to cut them, but you want to keep them nearby, so you might be able to, get them in on um, a minimum contract mid-year to bolster your team for a playoff run type of thing. Then you'd be like, yeah, sure, let's give him that so he can hang out here in Seattle and stay close while he recovers. The other part is that we just don't know the state of Adams's recovery. I mean, it was like the first quarter of the first game of the season. So he's been out quite a ways from that torn quadriceps tendon. So he could be relatively healthy right now. He could be still 6 months away. And that's a big unknown and nobody's reporting on it.
So one of the things I just looked at over the cap, and we've got, according to them, 17 million in change in salary cap. Now, some of that is going to be rookie stuff, about 10 million. So let's just say we have 7 million functional. They do not have the not Reggie Bush. I almost said Reggie Bush. They do not have the Devin Bush contract. They do not have the Jaron Reed contract listed yet. So those are going to come off of that figure. Essentially, we don't have any cap space left, minimal amount.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is, since we've got contracts yet to hand out, there's a lot of roster filler type roles yet to fill in, including some of our own free agents that were on the roster last year haven't yet been signed. Tyler Ott. There are other peripheral players on that roster that still need to be signed. Probably about $6-7 million worth at least. And so
there's nothing stopping Seattle from doing that, even with the cap situation as it is. So
until after the draft.
Not even until after the draft, until the first day of the league of the Tuesday before the first game. Okay. So what you look at is you have during the off season, which leads right up to the Tuesday before the first game. Only the top 51 contracts count against the cap. The Seahawks currently have 56 on the roster. So all of the roster filler guys that they want to bring back, Tyler Ott, who's going to make minimum, and that kind of stuff. Those guys aren't going to be in the top 51. So essentially they don't count until the Tuesday before the first game. Now, at that point, you have to have all your ducks in a row and that kind of stuff. But it gives you leeway to fill your roster and sign guys all off season, as long as you're signing guys that are cheap. So, if they were to go out and you get a guy like, I don't know, pick any player that's on free agency, and they sign him to a $2 million contract. Well, then they don't go in as $2 million right now. They go in as, they would go in as 1.25, because they would go in as 2, but they would kick Connor Weddington, who's the bottom. He's the 51st, 51st largest contract down out of that range. And so that's kind of where you're looking at. There's some
Right.
ability
So
to play
you
with all of
manipulate
this.
that. Okay.
Yeah,
So
and because that just gives you time. Now, you still have to be at that spot, which involves, at some point, you have to clear the cap space. You have to be able to go through and get rid of a big contract or trade a player or something in order to get down, so that way, once all those other players and all the practice squad guys and injured guys and everything else, once they start applying to the cap, you have to be under it. And so there's a lot of work to be done between now and then, but you can still sign guys. You can still fill your roster, and you're not stuck waiting.
Okay. So we got sidetracked a little bit there on all that stuff. But let's get to the meat and bones of the conversation here, and talk about different position groups. And we just go through it right from the top. And so this will include re-signing of our own players, where we're still have some roster holes, as well as signing outside free agents as well. We'll have that full conversation. So at quarterback, Seattle started free agency. They had to, not even started free agency, it was right before free agency, lock down this position so they knew how all the other puzzle pieces would fit. And so they re-signed Geno Smith to that contract. It's a 3-year, $75 million deal, 10 million, a little over $10 million first year cap hit. Great deal for Seattle. Geno's got his money. They also signed Drew Lock to a 1 year, $4 million deal. Not sure what the guarantees are on that. Don't have that particular detail. You might have that detail. It's a good deal. They brought back.
I couldn't find that piece of information, because they love Luck, and not.
Yeah. I would
he
imagine it's
didn't-
like a $1 million guarantee thing. It's probably a cuttable contract, but he's back. He's happy. He's got $1 million. It's one of those deals where, he made pretty decent money over the first 3 or 4 years of his deal, but he's in a situation now where he's kind of a year-to-year guy until he proves himself. And it's a familiar city, a familiar offense. Seattle, as you mentioned, likes him. He likes working under Geno Smith. It still provides him, I think, with a window of an opportunity to come in and affect the game if Geno should happen to need to sit out for a spell or whatever. And then who knows exactly what they would do in the draft, Keith, to still allow the draft to come to them. If a guy like Richardson or whatever is available at 5, or Stroud, CJ Stroud, do they pounce on that? Do they go for it? Have they really dug into the quarterback class in 2023 and said, if one of these guys are available, we're going to go ahead and take them and sit them on this roster, have a third quarterback on the roster all year or whatever. Or do they move on now and address other needs that the roster has?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. You're right. The draft has to come to them. If somebody trades up with Arizona, a quarterback needy team trades up to 3, Seattle's not going to get a quarterback, because the first 4 picks are going to be quarterbacks, and all the good ones are gone.
Yeah.
So it really kind of depends on how the draft falls and all of that. But this is what bringing back Lock does, is it gives them that hedge. They're not required to get a quarterback in this draft class. They have their roster filled. Like I was saying, they love Locke, not for what he's done on the field, but what he does in the prep room. He grinds film and with Geno and helps him with that. There's a lot of discussion. The two of them work really well together in terms of preparing and that kind of stuff. They love the way that Locke prepares, and they said it's been very beneficial to Geno. So that's why they brought him back, is because if you need a backup quarterback and you've got one that makes your starter better, of course you'd bring that person back. Now, if they draft a player, they may keep Locke around for a while, just because his grinding in the Room is a great asset. You teach younger player how to do that, all that kind of stuff, and it helps Chino. But that doesn't mean they have to keep him on the roster the whole time. They
Yeah.
may cut him part of the way through because the rookie's going to be ready at some point to,
Yes.
be there if Chino goes down.
And he's possibly an asset. I don't know that you would get much more than a 5th, 6th, 7th round pick for him, but maybe somebody flips a pick, depending on what happens in training camp and so forth. He could end up being a better option for some teams as a number 2 than they currently have. All right, running back.
Running back still in exactly the same spot where it was.
Not even exactly, really. I mean, they lost Penny, they lost Homer.
Well,
we knew they were unrestricted, but
they weren't on the roster. So Homer's not coming back. That's not completely shocking given his inability to run between the tackles, and he hasn't been able to stay healthy the last couple of years. So they've clearly moved on. Penny signing with the Eagles is unexpected.
$1.35 million for 1 year.
Yeah. So they didn't give him much, but at the same time, they could get a lot out of him if for some reason he manages to stay healthy for the first time in his career.
So where does that leave our roster?
It leaves Seattle with a combination of Dallas and Walker, and needing a running back, at least one, probably 2 between now and the start of the season.
Yeah, I would say probably 3. But one of those is going to end up being a practice squad guy or a guy that floats up and down on the roster. But you still need to fill that out. You've got 2 that you need to fill, I think. And they're just showing patience. It's not an emergency situation. Obviously, we're not going to go into the season that way. It's a pretty decent running back class, Keith. If there was a need matching up with the draft, this would be one of those position groups where Seattle can really help themselves in the draft, get a guy and get a guy well into the 4th or 5th round that's going to be able to come in, make your roster, play special teams, and kind of slide into whatever role they establish. Obviously, I think you and I have talked about the need for a larger running back that's kind of a physical guy that runs between the tackles that could complement Walker a little bit. The team may see it a little differently depending on how the draft unfolds. They might choose a guy that's more of a pass catching guy out of the backfield to replace the Homer kind of a pick. Maybe they do both.
Yeah, I think they probably do both. That's why I said probably 2, because you've got your starter, you've got a backup that you like, but he's a backup. He's not a bell cow kind of guy. And so if Walker does get hurt, you want to have a committee ready. And so you need your third down back, a Travis Homer type, and you need to replace Penny with your grinder, the guy that's going to run between the tackles real hard for you. And the Seahawks have carried 4 running backs a lot, pretty much all the time since Marshawn Lynch left. And so, I definitely see them adding 2. And I don't see a lot on the free agent market that I would be willing to spend money on. So my guess is it's a mid-round pick and a late-round pick.
Yeah, and people are speculating out there about Ezekiel Elliott and all that kind of stuff. Seattle's not going to do that. They've got Walker. They're not going to go spend $8 million that it would take to sign Elliott at this point in the offseason to come in. That's not what Seattle really wants to do at that position. I don't think that would shock me.
The other problem with that is that, did anybody watch Ezekiel Elliott play last year, or is this just because his name? Because he was not good. Yeah. Like, he was an absolute waste of money for Dallas. So I don't see the Seahawks going that route.
I don't either. Yeah, it'd be interesting. I mean, they really do love Walker. And Dallas obviously came on a little bit in the towards the end of the season as far as running hard and so forth. So I think they would feel comfortable with that duo plus a draft pick and then maybe a low cost veteran to come in. Abuaki is another guy that's out there that they had as far as a kick returner last year. I know that he's an unrestricted guy, and they haven't really, or is he restricted?
Might be I know that Tony Jones Jr. is a restricted free agent, but there's no way that they're tendering him a contract. So he will that will go through, and then they can sign him to a minimum deal if he wants. But where's Abuaki?
So he's an exclusive rights free agent.
Okay,
but he has not been tendered yet. So Michael Jackson was tendered, John Radigan, I know we're going through a few names now. Miles Adams was tendered. Cody Thompson and Igwebuike were still left out. So doesn't mean that he won't be back. It just means that they haven't made that move yet. I would like to see him actually come back. I'm just not sure where he's at as a running back in the running back room. But he brought value on special teams for sure, I thought.
Yeah, and for an exclusive rights contract, you're talking like usually like $480,000. Like
Well, it used to be 480. Now the minimum is 800. But
wait, it jumped that far for
yeah. Well, it's
for
780. I think is the entry level salary right now in the NFL.
No, I didn't think it was that low for first and second year players, that high. But okay.
Yeah. Okay. Wide receiver. So at wide receiver, they haven't made any moves.
No.
They've like I mentioned, Cody Thompson, they haven't retained. There's a guy out there like
Penny Hart is a restricted guy who's not coming back. Treadwell unrestricted. They haven't even touched that. Marquise Goodwin is unrestricted.
Which may be the guy that ultimately comes back for them, at least into camp to compete. But their wide receiver room needs a little bit of help. They've got DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, obviously,
and that's about it,
and a few others. And so we'll see how that goes. Derek Young, both of us really like Derek Young. He's going to get an opportunity, I think, to compete for that third spot. There's also going to be probably a wide receiver in this draft. It's a pretty decent wide receiver draft as they've been the last few years. Not quite as strong, but the depth wise through about 4 rounds is pretty decent, where a guy can come in and have an effect on your roster right away. Tight end, again, no moves, but they really didn't need to make one at this point. Nope. They've got 3 guys under contract and running back the same room in 2023 makes a lot of sense. That they were pretty effective, and that's only going to get better. They may address the position in the draft, but I don't see a tight end drafted in the first 2 or 3 rounds. I think this is going to be a guy that comes in and can compete and possibly goes back and forth, practice squad level kind of player.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean they've got 3 guys, so unless something happens and some guy falls to them and that they can't pass up, and then you look for a trade partner for Will Disley or Kobe Parkinson, and see what you can get out of that. But honestly, I think that they're pretty set.
Okay, so offensive line. This is where they did make a couple of moves. They re-signed Phil Haynes to a 1-year deal, $4 million deal. They added center Evan Brown from the Detroit Lions in free agency, a very friendly deal at $2.25 million. And they cut Gabe Jackson, saved $6.5 million doing that. So with Phil Haynes coming back at right guard, Pete Carroll seems to think he's starter level material there at right guard, although he's struggled with some injuries off and on in his career with Seattle so far. And then the Evan Brown thing from Detroit, can play both guard and center, is decent, not great at the position. That contract level dictates that it's going to be a competitive situation if they so choose to go center high in the draft to compete for a starting role. Let's just say it's Schmidt. That would allow Evan Brown to be able to be swing back and forth left and right guard as well as center backup. It's an upgrade of Kyle Fuller for sure.
Oh God, yeah.
So I thought that was a great move in free agency for Seattle.
I thought it was a fantastic move, because even if he comes in as the starter at center, it's an upgrade over Blythe. Not a huge upgrade, but an upgrade. But more importantly, with that, he's 27. He's going to be cheaper, and
he's he's a little larger. He's 320 pounds.
Yeah,
I think he can handle the interior rushers of the NFC West a little better.
He's a guy that has been playing guard, but he's naturally a center. I mean, he profiles as a center athletically. He played
came out as a center, in college, right?
They've just needed help at guard, so he's been playing there.
He played in 2021. He took all the snaps at center.
Okay, but at 2022, he took all the snaps at guard. So,
correct.
I think that he's a guy that you may get more out of by moving it back to his natural position.
And Pete Carroll
than
alluded to that already. John Snyder did in his weekly radio gig. Said that he's going to play center for the Seattle Seahawks.
It was interesting that when he was talking about how when they have their meeting, like a bunch of different scouts were like, "Hey, this is the guy we need to go get,"
And that was back in December.
Yeah, and that was because of things like the way he works, the way he works with coaches, the way he trains, the way he like puts in the time and those kind of things on top of um, what they see on the field. So it was one of the this is a character move on top of other things. So
I thought it was also a move that was kind of the offensive equal of Uchenna Nwasu move in the offseason last year on the defensive side, a guy that was a peripheral starter for a team, but had tremendous upside, looked like he could really do a lot more given the opportunity, given the snaps. And this guy is the same. He's kind of a tweener backup starter role that for Detroit. And here he's going to be given the opportunity to start and could come in and really have a good 4-year run if he ends up being the starter, where they don't need to address the position with a high draft pick in the draft. That would be an ideal situation for Seattle. Obviously, fans want Seattle to address that with a premier guy out of the draft. That's always fun to do, but maybe Seattle views it differently. They'd rather have that veteran experience in there right out of the gate.
Yeah, and the worst case scenario for this contract is that he is your 3-position backup, your swing guy at all 3 interior positions, and given his cap number, that's highly acceptable contract for that role. So overall, I thought this was a great signing.
And the really cool thing is, Keith, Kyle Fuller is unrestricted, and which means that we may not have to talk about him anymore. Now, the Seahawks could invite him back into training camp, and we'll see if that happens. They do seem to like him. He just doesn't translate on the field at all, and so I think Seattle would be much better served actually moving on. But we'll see how that goes. Anything else about the offensive line that we need to talk about before we move on?
No, other than we've said this before, their interior is still weak. It's even though they brought in Brown, they even if they think they've got their 5 starters, there's no depth. Whereas tackle is pretty solid.
Are you comfortable going into the season with Phil Haynes starting at right guard?
He was better than Jackson last year, and so as far as on-field play, I think they're okay. But I would be the lack of depth behind him because he has a guy that has a hard time getting healthy and staying healthy. I would be very concerned.
The interesting thing, and it's always interesting for me, the offseason, the way that they do roster construction and so forth. John Schneider always wants to go into the draft with hedges at every position, so he's not pressing with need driving the draft. He'd rather let best player available come to him, etc. But we've got so many high draft picks in this draft, 5 picks in the top 85 or 86. We're going to come out of the draft with some starters at some positions here. Now we're going to go through this show, and we're going to talk about Seattle being, needing certain positions filled, but we've already addressed most of these spots in free agency with really good players at each of these spots for the most part, and we're going to go into the draft without really too many needs, which is the best case scenario for Seattle to be able to, not necessarily need a starting caliber right guard, but one sitting there at 20, and we draft the best guard in the class to come in, and it just makes the roster better. That's why I think Seattle's really going to be positioned. I think we've knocked this free agency aspect part of the draft or the offseason out of the park, because now the draft's going to come, and after the draft, everyone's going to be talking about Seattle.
True, but I think that they well, that's true on offense. I like where the roster stands, except for maybe a wide receiver or two. The defense, I think, still needs some work. And so we kind of look what they've done there.
Let's talk about the defensive line,
because the defensive line has had a major shakeup. They have brought in Jerron Reed. That name should sound familiar. He was with Green Bay last year and Kansas City the year before.
Drafted by Seattle in the second
Drafted
round
by
out of Alabama.
in 2016. So a guy that is good pass rusher, seems to get a lot of sacks. A guy that can push up the middle, three tech, ideally. And so he's going to come back and be there. And they've also signed Dramont Jones, who goes by Dre, apparently, who is an elite,
Interior
guy. He's probably going to be the 5 tech. He's going to replace Shelby Harris. He's only 26. It's a 3-year, deal. He's the big money signing for this year.
Literally. I mean, let's talk about that for a second. He received a $17 million deal per year average. That's the biggest free agency deal the Seahawks have signed under Pete Carroll and John Schneider.
Yeah.
How did you think the approach? Let's talk about this right now. It's a good time with his name. What did you think of the overall approach that Seattle had? Did it surprise you at all how aggressive they were in the first week of free agency?
A little bit. I mean, that's a huge contract, but Seattle looked at it as a position of absolute need. I mean, they needed to fix the defensive line. They needed a guy on that defensive line that could be the centerpiece and force other teams to account for. You couldn't just line up and have. They need someone who is going to dominate and going to blow up plays and is going to make offensive coordinators worry. And they haven't had that. And Jones is that guy. Jones was actually a guy that the Seahawks tried to trade for with the Wilson trade. He was one of the names that was tossed out there. And the Broncos were like, no, not at all. They're absolutely unwilling to include him. And then that's part of why Shelby Harris got thrown in. And in part because Denver needed to get rid of that contract. Now the Seahawks end up with Jones anyway. They just get him a year later. So,
yeah, I think it's a terrific signing. I mean, I was thrilled with the signing. I think he's a diverse lineman, can play 5 tech. He can go inside for you at the 3 tech. He's not going to be your nose tackle, but he's good at defending the run, blowing up plays, that sort of thing, collapsing the pocket. You'd mentioned the previous show when we talked about free agency, how he lived in the backfield. That's very true. I think this is a great hedge. This may show their hand as far as what they feel about Carter in the draft, because Carter is going to be able to play a similar role for you in a defense, and now they don't have to necessarily go that way. I think that's important. And may show that they've taken him off their draft board, although some information about Carter came out this week as far as his legal stance. He was essentially convicted. He pled no contest in the case. He was fined. He was given a year probation. I think that's the best case scenario for him out of this situation. And the way that it was depicted from his side, his attorney released a statement on his behalf that said that he stayed at the scene, in fact, after the accident, and only left after he was told he could leave by police. They had some further questions after about an hour and a half. They invited him back to the scene to answer further questions, which he did. That wasn't clear initially when we talked about him.
No, actually, it made it sound like he had left because and then came back an hour and a half later. The idea that he stayed, was released, and then asked to return for additional questions is a different story.
It is a different story, and it initially put him in kind of a legal limbo of leaving a scene, as well as depicted him with less than optimal character. I think this changes things now, and now he had a quote unquote horrible pro day workout where he failed to finish the workout. He had gained some weight. I don't know that that's necessarily a big deal, but all these things kind of add up.
Gained so 9 pounds since the combine.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if teams asked him to, or somebody said that was a thing, or he just didn't work out at all for 2 weeks. But I just don't find that credible. So if something's going on, teams are going to really have to vet. I would imagine Seattle, sitting where they're at in the draft, are one of those teams. Seattle's going to be vetting this player because here's a guy that can really help you on defense as far as what he can do on the football field. All of these other things are peripheral. What does the tape show? And that's where Seattle's going to be focused, as well as character, how he interviews, what he has to say, how all these things add up. They're probably working overtime on this player.
Well, yeah, because as far as just on the field, like just looking at the tape and not considering all this other stuff, he's the best defensive player in the draft, in my opinion. Some people will say he's the second best defensive player in the draft, but whatever. But these are our big concerns, and so we'll see what happens with that. The 9 pounds, I mean, it depends on what was going on, because if he's back in Atlanta, he's trying to take care of all of this legal stuff, and who knows, maybe he wasn't able to get the workouts in because he was sitting in a courtroom or talking to a lawyer and sitting in meeting rooms the whole time. So that's entirely possible too. I'm sure he'll have a private quote unquote pro day or workout with teams closer to the draft, and is fine. And if that's the case, I would expect him to go top 10 again.
So Seattle's began to address the defensive line. So we did the Jerron Reed thing. We released also Quentin Jefferson. By releasing Shelby Harris and Jefferson, we generated $13.5 million combined in cap savings. Of course, we've spent that. But Brian Monet is still there. Al Woods is still under contract to be the nose tackle for now. That's still another area of concern for Seattle, just depth-wise overall. Maybe they've penciled in these guys as starters, but we're really lacking some depth. I think they still continue to address. John Snyder came out and said, we're still looking to improve the defensive line in his show. So they're still looking at a number of guys in free agency. Ashawn Robinson has been mentioned, although he had a visit with another team here yesterday. Don't know if that resulted in a deal. Seattle could still be in play for somebody like that, a run stuffing kind of player to come in. But they don't have a lot of cap room remaining in free agency. So we'll see. They'd have to generate, you mentioned Jamal Adams. There's a few other restructure type deals that could happen. If they want the money and they want the player, Bobby Wagner's another example. They can generate whatever they need to do to bring guys in.
Yeah.
All right. How about linebacker, Keith?
So linebacker is an interesting spot because the Seahawks saw Cody Barton leave to go to the Commanders. He was okay last year. He wasn't great. wasn't as bad as I think a lot of people think. Especially in the second half of the year, he really came on, played better, and showed why the Seahawks had used a 3rd round pick on him. But he's gone, and his running mate there at the interior linebacker spot, Brooks, is injured. I mean, he tore that quadriceps tendon in week 16. It was near the end of the season. He may not be ready for the beginning of this next season, and that left Seattle with 0 interior linebackers on the roster. And this is a major issue. It was kind of a weakness last year because they had no depth, and now they've lost both. They lost one guy, and the other guy is sitting there hurt and may not play at the beginning. So they addressed it a little bit. They went out and signed Devin Bush, who came over from the Steelers. A 25-year-old guy, was the 10th overall pick in the draft when he was taken. He's actually younger than some of the guys in this upcoming draft class, like Stetson Bennett, Hendon Hooker, right? He's younger than them. Tore up, just shredded his knee, with the Steelers.
In his second season.
Yep. And so looked really good as a rookie, as you'd expect from the 10th overall pick in the draft. Just destroyed his knee, has never really gotten back to form. And, so there's 2 years, 2 full seasons between him tearing up his knee and now. And the fact that he just has never gotten back to that form is why the Steelers were okay with letting him walk. But Seattle gets a 25-year-old guy with a ton of upside if he can get that knee right. Because at the comp, I mean, before the draft, he was an explosive athlete, slightly undersized,
Slightly
massive
undersized, yes.
speed,
I mean, he's like 6 foot, 222 pounds, something like that. At least when he came
230.
out. When he came out, okay, 230 now. So has he lost the explosiveness? Well, that's what gave him the advantage to begin with. Was
Yeah.
his explosiveness, his speed, his his ability to be scheme diverse, etc. Seattle, I would imagine, views him as a inside linebacker, as obviously,
Yeah.
and can he go sideline to sideline? How's his agility? How's that closing speed, etc. You mentioned Cody Barton. You ideally put him next to either Brooks or somebody else that's a veteran presence in the middle of that defense. And with Brooks maybe not making it to the first game, possibly coming in later in the season, coming off IR, and his own knee injury, I would, while Devin Bush might be a fine player, and I know that Seattle probably did their due diligence on his knee, on his ability to still be athletic enough to be in their defense. So having him come in is a hopeful sign for him. But Seattle still has a major hole. Even after that signing, John Schneider called it an area of concern for them. And so, I don't know that they're done as far as in free agency. There's only a few guys out there right now. Denzel Perryman, free agent from the Raiders. Anthony Walker from the Browns. Rashaan Evans, who I liked out of the draft, is still there. Previously played with the Falcons. And then of course Bobby Wagner.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll see what happens there. Bobby Wagner's obviously a fan favorite. Everyone wants to see him come back. He's lost a few steps, but if that interior defensive line improves, he could actually have another good season. I think he showed that with the Rams last year. Lost the steps, but his instincts are top notch. And so I would not mind a 1 year of Bobby Wagner in there. And then when Brooks comes back, you've got Wagner, Brooks, and then Devin Bush. You've solved that that linebacker situation and much improved over last year.
And I think you've also got a draft pick. I cannot see them coming out of this,
Of course. Yeah.
without a draft pick. The one person who we didn't mention in that particular conversation was John Radigan,
Yeah.
who is 24. He's was an
Team really
explosive
loves
right
John.
guy. They love him. He was hurt last year. But I honestly think that given the situation, they're going to give him a long look during training camp and preseason to see if he can take a guy like Devin Bush and say, yeah, we don't need you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also agree about your assessment on getting a guy in the draft, and not just any guy, probably a top, using one of their top 4 picks on a linebacker, I think is probably what's going to happen. There's some good value there. It drops off a little bit after, say, Jack Campbell, like, a traditional thumper guy in the middle. There's some quicker, more athletic guys, but undersized available as well at closer to the top of the draft. And we'll see which direction they go. But I would imagine, like I said earlier, you're wanting to essentially hedge your entire roster before you head into the draft. But we've got so many high picks. Guys are going to get pushed out of those hedge spots, and Devin Bush is the clear example of that. Of course, we've got Brooks that could begin the season on IR. We've got to address that spot. And a high pick in the draft. If you don't get a veteran free agent to come in and hold Brooks's spot down until he's ready, you would almost have to get a high pick in the draft to quote unquote have a starter out of the draft at linebacker, because if you're going to rely on a guy coming in the 3rd or 4th round, that's just not going to happen.
Yeah. Now they could do both. If they could figure out a way to get Bobby Wagner on the roster to be the starter there, and then also a draft pick, and then when Brooks comes back, then now you've got a 3rd guy that you can rotate in and do different things with, and then you're set up with the 2 starters next year if Wagner retires and does that. So I could see them doing both, another veteran and a high draft pick.
All right, so let's talk about the secondary. Let's start in the safety spot. We'll just kind of move around a little bit. Seahawks went out and signed Julian Love, the strong safety, free safety, hybrid kind of guy that plays as well in the slot, can do it all for you. I love this signing. It's one of my favorite signings of free agency for Seattle. He reached an agreement on a 2-year, $12 million deal. Not sure what the breakdown is on the salary cap for 2023 is. I'm sure it favors Seattle. And really nice signing there. They brought back Ryan Neal, and they brought back Michael Jackson as far as a exclusive
Corner.
rights free agent at the corner spot. They've got Brown coming back fully healthy after last year, coming back halfway through the season, and this really just kind of adds to the strength of the entire secondary. And so now you've got a lot of money invested at the safety position. Keith, what's going on?
Well, and this is part of the reason why I think that Jamal Adams is gone. Julian Love gives them flexibility. He gives them a guy who's good in coverage at safety, which Adams isn't. He can cover as a slot corner if you need him to. He can play up in the box. He can play the deep thing. He's super scheme diverse. Can do pretty much anything. He's a kind of a perfect pairing with a guy like Quandre Diggs, because now you can rotate those guys and not have them line up in the same spot. And so you can confuse opposing quarterbacks more by rotating your safeties around, and, one play they're in one spot, another play they're in another spot, and you can do that kind of stuff. Ryan Neal's the same. He was the starting strong safety last year, after Adams went down, and actually has played better last year than Adams has at any point with Seattle. So,
Is there a chance that Seattle restructures Jamal Adams instead of cuts him, saves $6-7 million in salary cap in doing so, runs Jamal Adams, Julian Love, Ryan Neal, and Diggs out there, and runs a lot of safety looks, a lot of dime looks, a lot of too high looks, and just has a really diverse. But that's a lot of money invested in your safety class.
That's a lot of money invested in the safety class. And, you look at, I don't know, and it's a lot of investment. It's a lot of your salary cap and just your resources invested in a position where you have to work to get the third one on the field.
Does Seattle view
Getting the fourth one on the field is tough.
Does Seattle view Julian Love more exclusively in the slot?
I don't think so. Because they see him as a hybrid safety, not as a cornerback. I don't think that's the case. You know that the two players for next year's cap that have the largest cap hits on Seattle's roster, Jamal Adams and Quandre Diggs.
Yeah.
So
plus, Neal at $2 million. I'm sure they probably want to figure out if they can get him extended long term, and then Julian Love at $6 million, $7 million a year. That's a lot. I mean, that's close to $40 million of your cap invested at the safety position. But I get it. I get why they signed Julian Love. He was their defensive captain, play caller on the field, wore the green dot on his helmet, and this safety class, Keith, as we've talked about in the draft, is horrible.
When I look at this signing, the fact that he is the play caller, right? He's the guy with the green dot, not the middle linebacker, which is typical. They used it as the safety, the guy that was all over the field, and was the captain. To me, that says they brought him in to start,
and possibly take Jamal Adams' role
or Quandre Diggs's role.
Oh, right. I mean, he's really actually that good. He could do both.
Yeah, and if they traded Quandre Diggs tomorrow, they would save $9.5 million against the cap. If they trade him after June 1st, they save $14 million against the cap. Um, Now, if you cut him, you get a lot less because there's a lot of guaranteed money still. And so even post June 1st, it's only 510,000. So my guess is that
A move to be
there's
made.
there's some trade talks to happen.
The team loves Quandre Diggs, though.
They do,
And
but
Quandre Diggs loves the team. I
it's
mean,
still $18
that would
million.
be that would be an interesting move to me. I could see it just from an economical standpoint, but from a football standpoint, I'm not sure if it makes sense.
Yeah, it makes no sense,
Yeah.
honestly. But I'm just saying, like, from a financial standpoint, this is it to me. It continues to point to Jamal Adams. I know that I've been saying this for a while, and everyone keeps saying no, they're wrong. There's no way they're going to do that. He's too good. Blah blah blah. They've got nothing from him. They're not. You're trying to replace. You're trying to replace zero production, and you're using up 18 million of your salary cap for a guy that gave you nothing last year. Getting that, 8.5 million of salary cap's worth it. I just don't see why people keep pushing back. It just makes way too much sense for them to go, especially now that Love's on the team.
Yeah, and I do think that especially if they brought back Bobby Wagner, there's just no way that they could have Bobby Wagner and all four safeties. It just, I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe they could pull it off for 1 year, and maybe that's what they want to do. They just want to have their roster just injury proof and go in and just be as strong as possible, and they can get away with it and the cap. Maybe they do it. I think, Jamal Adams, something needs to happen there, whether he's cut or restructured. Maybe if they really value him and they think that he's going to be able to come back from his injury and have an effect on the roster and the team, maybe the restructure makes more sense. But that remains to be seen. We'll see.
Well,
All right.
there are. I mean, with Adams, if it's a pure pay cut, then yeah, I could see it a little bit. As far as restructuring the deal, changing salary to bonus and pushing it out to the following year, man, you can generate 6.6 million in cap space on Adams's contract, but you make him uncuttable next year. And I don't think you want to do that. A guy that you could do that with is Tyler Lockett, who you could save 5.5 million or less. I mean, it all depends on how much you convert, but you can push that out into later years. That might be something that they do. Will Disley, you can do something similar with for 2.2. Quandre Diggs, you could generate 6. So there's some options as far as not cutting guys, but just pushing cap hits from this year out into next year.
Right.
But you'd only want to do that.
You would only do that, Keith, if you felt like you were a Super Bowl contender.
Yeah. Or you've got some just really nasty contract dead money coming off the books, and so you're like, okay, well, we'll use, it'll go into the cap, but it'll take that spot. The Seahawks were kind of in that position a year ago at this time because of the Wilson trade. Now they're not. I mean, they've got a couple of guys that are sitting there with some dead money for this year, but no individual one is like super terrible.
Gabe Jackson is at 4.7. Carlos Dunlap is still out there at 4.2. Shelby Harris now at 3.2. Quentin Jefferson, 2 million. Chris Carson is still going to be on the hook for about 1.7 overall. But those aren't horrible numbers. Those are 16. Last year, our dead cap was over 40, just to give you an example. So we've come down from that. These are going to be off the books as of 2024. So it's not a horrible situation long term.
Yeah.
So the last one I wanted to talk to you about was just taking a look at our special teams. We've got Michael Dixon. We re-signed Jason Myers to a 4-year deal, so he's locked up now. But the long snapper, we don't like to talk about the long snapper position, but that seems to be the only thing in free agency, or not free agency, in special teams for the Seahawks that has not yet been addressed. Carson Tinker came in for the season 2022 and seemed to play well. We didn't have to talk about him much at all. So he's a guy that could definitely do the job. Tyler Ott got injured, was on injured reserve all year. and he's out there both unrestricted. And so they've got to make a decision on something. They could be those guys. It could be a guy that's not even on the roster yet. We just don't know about. I would imagine it would be a league minimum deal to bring one of those two guys back.
Oh, absolutely. So, but yeah, and it's going to be a league minimum deal. No one pays a long snapper more than that. And
Tyler Rod actually had a decent contract when he signed. He had a 3-year deal, and it was over. It was about a $2 million a year deal on average, which was about 800,000 over league minimum for a vet.
His AYP, according to Over the Cap, was 1.1 million.
Tyler Rott?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Interesting. I thought he ended up signing a bigger deal than that. But
yeah, it was 1.11 million. He did get 1.25 million in guarantees when he signed that deal, which is huge for a long snapper. But yeah.
Okay.
So,
cool.
But yeah, I mean, they need one. They need to make sure that they'll take care of it. But if you're looking at the cap and you're like, okay, well, that's another $1 million off the cap that is going to go to a long snapper. You can't go into a season without one.
So you made a point earlier in the show that you don't feel like that Seattle is done in free agency yet. Although I would argue that most of the major moves, most of the big moves, seem to be done.
Yes.
However, Bobby Wagner could still be a player. They could still make a move at wide receiver. There's a few out there that might interest them. I think overall, though, beyond linebacker and maybe a wide receiver or a running back coming in, there's not going to be a lot of big contracts.
No,
they're out
of cap room. When I say they're not done, they're going to bring in a linebacker. We don't know who, but there is no way they go into the draft with the current linebacker room. Someone is getting re-signed. I
was actually really surprised they didn't. Who was the guy I mentioned to you yesterday on a text?
Drew Tranquil.
Drew, I was surprised. Drew Tranquil got a $3.5 million deal, and he had 110 tackles last year, quite a few different sacks and pass breakups. Just overall, a pretty decent player. And that would have been a great signing. I would have liked that much better than Bobby Wagner, to be completely honest, because I think Bobby Wagner is going to end up getting a $7 to $10 million deal. I don't know where that's going to wash out as far as his market is concerned. That'll drive that process, but he's going to get a lot of money just because he's Bobby Wagner and came off a pretty decent year last year.
Mm-hmm.
And a younger player in Tranquil for a lot less money would have made a lot more sense to me.
Yeah. Agreed. It was still a 1-year deal. This is a guy that's at 1 year of as a starter, and yeah, he looked good, but there's not a huge track record, and there must have been some reason. And part of it, the other thing is that you have to have both sides have to want it.
Absolutely.
Right? And if he's like, no, I really want to go to this other team for pick other reasons, it doesn't matter.
Exactly.
You have to throw a lot of extra money at him to get him to go there. So maybe he just didn't want to come to Seattle.
A little bit of, you can still hear us. It's a good conversation. We'll continue to have it, as the weeks go on. Now we're going to be talking about some private workouts. The top 30 visits for Seattle are going to kind of come into play. We can kind of see where they're leaning as far as the players that they're looking at. And it'll be a fun conversation. Going to do this all the way up to the draft. I'm heading up to the Northwest to watch the draft with my folks and Keith as well. So, and it'll just be a great time. This is just a fun time of the year for us, and it's a good off season so far for the Seahawks.
Yeah, so far it's been pretty good. And the draft is still coming, which is typically the funnest part.
Excuse me. So anyway, let's get out of here. You can find Keith on Twitter. Excuse me. Can you take us out of here, Keith?
Yeah. You can find me on Twitter at Myers NFL. You can find Bill at NW Seahawk, Northwest Seahawk. You can find the show everywhere. We're on every podcast platform. We are on YouTube. We've got the video version of this. You can feel free to come on and watch us. But no matter what, just subscribe and tell your friends, tell your family. If you're into the Seahawks, you made it this far into the show, then you know we're worthwhile. So please subscribe to the show. It helps us out a lot. So until next time, go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
Seahawks Playbook podcast listeners, thanks for joining us for another edition of the show. You can find us on Twitter. Bill is at NW Seahawk, Keith is at Myers NFL, and the show is at Hawks Playbook. You can listen and subscribe to the show at SeahawksPlaybook.com.